Next, we have Ian Dawson from Augmented Studio. And finally, we have Shelley Peterson from Wizard Wells. Take it away.
Hi, Shelley.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us late on this Thursday. I have to tell you, I'm so excited about this fireside chat. How many people in here have seen Iron Man? Right? Pretty much everyone. Are you familiar with JARVIS in Iron Man? Of course we are. Well, Ian is the VFX producer for Iron Man's JARVIS. And so he has quite the stories about how that came about. If you're like me, I studied what I saw in Iron Man when I was looking at user interface and the concepts of what would be possible when I first started working with augmented reality. We didn't have the term XR at the time. We referred to it as augmented even before mixed reality. And so I'm so excited to chat with you. And Daniel is the CEO of Red 6. And who here is familiar with Red 6? Yes. So you know how impressive this is. And for me, it seems like this is what we see and what we dream about and what we are inspired by coming to life in a real form for real purpose and real use. Now, I'm going to tell you, we were going to do an introduction between the two because they had never met back about a month ago, 2 months ago. And I thought, this is going to be an interesting discussion. I need to tape it. And so instead of doing that introduction, I said, we need to keep you two separated, and we're going to have an introduction on stage. So here we go. So Ian, would you like to introduce the specifics of what you do?
Sure. I'm a visual effects producer by heart and by trade. But I started doing VR back in 1990 in the medical field, kind of more as a hobby outside of the visual effects work and design work that I was producing, and got the opportunity to work on Iron Man and Iron Man 2 and ultimately Iron Man 3, designing and coming up with that look of what JARVIS might be. And at that point, I kind of decided, how do we turn this fantasy into reality? And so I kind of went back into the VR and AR space and have been sort of doing both visual effects, design, animation, and
so cool.
doing apps for AR and VR. So that's kind of what I've been doing.
That's amazing. And Daniel, tell us about Red 6.
So I'm the CEO and founder of Red 6. Red 6 is an AR company that is working with the Department of Defense. And what we've done is we've created, I think, the world's first outdoor augmented reality world, but up in the sky. So my background, I was a fighter pilot. I had nothing to do with AR or VR other than in flight simulators. But every time I used to go up to fly and train, I needed someone to fly and train against, in very simple terms. And at scale, that's a multi-billion-dollar-a-year problem that we've been failing at as not just this country, but allied nations around the world. And so the way we traditionally train fighter pilots is we either sit in airplanes and we fly against other pilots in airplanes, or we're in simulators. And the problem with simulation is it doesn't emulate or simulate the cognitive loads and the stress that we're under as flying a high-performance airplane that will kill you in the blink of an eye if you're not on your game. So the question I asked myself at the genesis of Red 6 was, is there a third way that sits in the middle? And could I theoretically drag simulation and make it work outdoors? And I didn't know anything about augmented reality at the time, but it struck me that obviously no one's going to allow us to fly around in virtual reality. Right. So the question was, could we make augmented reality work outdoors, up in the sky at 1,000 miles an hour, going upside down and pulling G's? And that's what we've done. So you can fly physical airplanes, look out through the optical system, and train against virtual airplanes or AR airplanes controlled by AI, which allows us to scale training and give it as much frequency as we want, and obviously train to relevant threats as well.
So I think this is amazing. Back before I worked for Lockheed, I worked on the B-1 bomber simulator at Dyess Air Force Base. And it's this big simulator on a motion base, and has amazing capability, but you don't have that G-force, and it's not quite the same as being in the aircraft. And really, the pilots who'd spent the most time in the aircraft were the most likely to become nauseous in the simulator because it didn't feel like the actual aircraft.
Yeah.
But you miss out on all of these factors that you're talking about when you're not in the air. And to have that type of capability in air, but then I assume your adversaries or other aircraft you're putting in augmented reality form.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's probably more juxtaposed than that. The simulation and being in simulators is in no way, shape, or form is the same as doing it for real life.
Right.
Your brain just doesn't work the same, right, under those kind of strains. So it's essential we fly, and the question is how do we fly as efficiently as we can and get representative training? And we just don't have the dollars to solve for the supply-demand problem. We've got a massive demand signal for training, chronic undersupply. So how do we get the best of both worlds? Simulation's amazing for creating environments you want to go train in. There's no question about it. But we have to be able to fly. We talk about getting air under our asses every day. It's really important we do that because the human brain doesn't work the same. And so your decision-making process is fundamentally different. But if we can drag simulation outside now, we get the best of both worlds. We get the ability to do it for real, juxtaposed against all of the benefits that simulation brings with it. And the challenges, of course, are making AR work outside in that kind of environment, which I know we discussed earlier on. It's significant.
This is different with do you use accelerometers? How do you...
What's that, sorry?
Do you use accelerometers? How do you...
Yeah, I mean, we were chatting about it. There's two real fundamental problems that we had to solve for. I mean, look, when I started this, I didn't know anything about AR, and the co-founder of my business, a gentleman named Glenn Snyder, you guys may have seen it. Back in 2015, he did something called virtual drift, and he took two race cars, put them on two separate racetracks at the same time, connected the drivers into a common virtual world, and they were in different locations, but raced real race cars blind to the outside world in VR. When I met Glenn and I saw what he'd done, I asked two fundamental questions. Can we do this in airplanes? Yes, technically more difficult. But clearly no one's going to allow fighter pilots to fly around in VR, in real airplanes, so could we do that in AR? And the answer I got back was no, AR really doesn't work outside or in dynamic environments where you're in a markerless background up in the sky. So we had to think about how do we solve for tracking and understand, 6 degrees of freedom in absolute terms relative to the real world. How do we get that with no markers in the background? That was the first problem. And then once we solved that and we thought, oh, we've got this, we tried every headset out there, and of course there's just nothing that was remotely capable of generating the kind of light resolution, field of view, brightness that we need to do to be up in the sky, which is a 10,000 nit background. So we need to be able to overcome the challenges of light and the environment. So those were the two real core engineering focuses that we had to solve for to give us the kind of thing that you brought to life with Iron Man. And as you know, Shelley, it's working really well now.
Had you seen Iron Man before this
Of course,
pursuit?
I was fanboying on Ian as soon as I came in here.
I think we all were.
Two movies.
And I'm a fanboy of his. So.
The two movies that really influenced the vision behind Red 6, one was Iron Man and of course JARVIS, and the idea that the way we interact with digital content from an operational sense as a military background, it makes intuitive sense, right? Exactly what he was doing. The second one was Ender's Game, and the idea, the big reveal for Ender, of course, is that at the end of the film, he realizes he's actually doing the job for real when he actually thinks he's in a simulated environment. And that posed a very interesting question for me. If we get this right, and we can create simulated worlds outside, and we can interact in them in whatever vehicle it may be, and ultimately on foot, then when we go to do the job for real, the only difference should be that it's real stuff coming back at you. And that's the end vision. So it was Iron Man and Enders that really influenced us, which I thought is really interesting how you talked about it in terms of movies influencing reality, and reality then subsequently influencing movies, which was, I thought, a brilliant way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the research that we had done, our task was to, what is this going to look like 20, 30 years in the future? And so, we had to go back and research things that, Tom Furness had done, and
Yes.
Evans and Sutherland had done, and lots of other people in the space had done, and what people had written about what the future might be, and figure out what that might look like. And we had three amazing creative directors: Danny Yount, Ilya Bolkanov, and Paul Mitchell, who worked on that. And I just was the guy with the whip. But no, they were incredible designers, and so pulling that inspiration to create this idea of what an AI and AR might look like in the future, minus the holograms, of course, because we don't really have holograms that can just appear in front of us unless we have a headset of some sort. But I think we came pretty close, and you and I, you brought me up to Microsoft recently to see what they were doing with Copilot and AR, and basically I think I said, oh, we're finally here, Jarvis is in front of me. It's great.
Very interesting to see AI integrated with XR, and we're at the start of seeing the real aspects of that, but what we see in Hollywood, it inspires us. And I want to provide a little bit of context for the time frame of Iron Man 1. So I went back and watched again just recently so it would be fresh on my mind. And in the very start of Iron Man 1, Tony Stark references MySpace. Okay, do y'all remember MySpace? This was before Facebook was a thing. And so that's the time frame of when that movie came out. And this is a time when you're envisioning AI integrated with XR in the form of Jarvis, in the form of an assistant. Like, how did you go about working through the development of that, the brainstorming sessions, right? How did you do that?
I mean, I had a little bit of background in VR, from 1990, and I knew about Tom and Jaron Lanier and a lot of the pioneers, some of which are being honored at this conference. But I think it was just all of us, that core team, just pulling from every different kind of reference we could find to make stuff. We had a lot of different ideas, and if you want, we can show. I brought a video of stuff. Not a lot of people have seen it. Is on my site, but it's sort of it's like 2.5 minutes of some of the development work we did. We got paid for 4 to 6 months to just explore ideas, which sort of doesn't happen very often in the film business. But I could show you some of that stuff.
I would love to see that. Would y'all love to see that?
Yeah, go ahead and play it. So I'm gonna give Lee Buckley a shout out in there if he's ever watching this. He's the guy in there. He was our design coordinator at the time. But you know, it was a lot about like how do you represent data? How do you you know, how will people interact with data? You know, that was even before sort of thinking about JARVIS and an AI, because that was part of already the script. But really, how are you representing this data and displaying this data to people, and how will that be represented? And so they had shot the, you know, pieces of the film, so they had given us those pieces to do temps over and stuff like that. But that reel is, you know, all that material, as well as a book of probably 250 stills, was what we ended up going in and presenting. And a lot of that stuff is actually in the movie.
So one of the questions I have, one of the things I notice in this video is, and in the movies, is that he's interacting with the data with his hands. And the user interface was different than anything else we had at that time. And Tony Stark, of course, is played by Robert Downey Jr. How did you work with him to get the right motions and action? Did you inform him on what you envisioned him doing, or did he come up with? How did you do that?
Yeah. So there's a funny story there. First of all, you know, I had worked with the VPL headset and the data glove early on, you know, from what Jaron had created at VPL, and so we knew I knew about the whole interacting with objects and whatnot, using your hands as a data input. And you know, Danny Yount, who was our senior creative director at Prologue at the time where I was working, and he had spent a lot of time putting together, you know, ideas of what motions he wanted Robert Downey Jr. to do, and you know, what kind of, you know, movements, hand movements, finger movements, whatever. And we got to set, and you know, we had a meeting with Robert, and Danny's explaining to him what he wanted to do, and you know, Robert was very patient with him, and you know, let him go through it. But eventually, Robert kind of said, you know, I'm an actor. You do what you do. I do what I do. I'm going to do what I do, and you guys are going to have to figure it out afterwards. And so we did. It worked out. We were very nervous that day on set, thinking like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? But you know, we got it back to the office and tracked all the shots and figured out how to make it work.
So
and it worked magically. It was amazing.
He did the gestures, and then you had to build the digital content around
We
that.
had to build the content around what he was doing. Yeah,
That's
which
incredible.
was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
He's an actor. He needs to be free and not be thinking about what he's doing, you know, or be doing that based on how he feels comfortable doing it,
Right.
and how he wants to represent that. So,
It comes together incredibly well.
yeah, it was surprising because we were really nervous for a while there. So,
It's interesting to pull on that thread. I mean, the human being is obviously centric to everything that we design around as well. And one of the challenges we often have inside of Red 6 is the engineers will get in a room and they'll come up with amazing ideas, right? And then you put them in a room with the pilots and they'll go, what the hell is this? None of it is human-centric or thought through. So it's really important, you know, for us as well to keep the human at the center of that loop. There's another interesting anecdote as well, as we, which ties into what you're doing. As we started developing and building Red 6, we got a hangar at Santa Monica Airport. And there was a hangar right next to us at Santa Monica Airport. And I never understood what was going on there. There was always people coming backwards and forwards. And over time, ironically, it turns out that our hangar was right next door to Robert Downey Jr. himself. Oh, wow. And so as we became friends with Robert, and actually Iron Man invested in Red 6. So it's a really interesting story as to how it's come full circle.
that's cool.
The other thing that I think is worth pulling apart is there's a market coming now for AR that's building upon what we've done at Red 6. And you'll see an interesting shift, I'm sure most of you are aware, towards unmanned platforms or collaborative combat aircraft that are working, you know, out there autonomously, driven by AI algorithms. But the important thing to note is that human beings are still going to be absolutely essential to what it is we do to project power in the future. And AI is really good for certain tasks, but it's not so good for other complex, you know, chaotic type of environments. So the question is, how do human beings and the AI work well together? And the thing that we're pulling on and discovering right now is that UX/UI interface, leveraging augmented reality, is going to be essential for next generation of air combat. As you think about the future platforms that are penetrating contested airspace, the role of a fighter pilot, the cognitive load that is on us in airplanes is enormous as it is. But now they want us to go up and interact with multiple unmanned airplanes as well. And my little brain just, probably explodes. It struggles at the best of times. But AR offers some really interesting opportunities to create a digital canvas into which we can keep situational awareness. So as we're penetrating airspace through AR, I can look out and I can just visually see. I don't need to be looking at my sensors now. I can have a grasp of where are my assets, what status are they, what's their weapon loadout, what's their fuel state, exactly just by looking across the canvas. And that's some of the pioneering work we're doing inside of Red 6. Beyond just creating the simulated environments, there's enormous operational use cases for the technology, which is exactly what we saw in JARVIS and Iron Man. So it is really coming full circle, and that stuff's becoming a reality right now.
And in Ender's Game, the creative director there was a gentleman named G-Monk.
Okay.
So hopefully one day you get to meet him.
Yeah, I'd love to get to meet him. Yeah, for sure.
That's interesting. It's the user interface allows for enhanced situational awareness, which is critical for pilots. The human factors is a very important aspect. And I think we saw some of that in the JARVIS HUD.
Yeah.
And how is it laid out within the HUD for Red 6? Is it in peripheral?
Yeah, so it's a great question because there was the classical head-up displays that we use in cockpits, and when you see platforms like F-35 now, you see the helmet-mounted queuing systems that go inside of the helmets. So we're putting another layer of digital content on top of that, right? And the challenge for us is how do we render the digital content to create virtual entities that are out there to train against, but still preserve all of the digital content that we need to do the job for real and overlay it onto the visor in a way that is digestible for the operators as well. And so one of the things we do there is we obviously have to solve head tracking in a really compelling way, but by layering in eye tracking now as a digital as a technology as well, we can do foveated rendering or eye tracking based rendering to understand not just the information that is necessary to draw to the pilot, but start to understand things like cognitive load that's on the operator right now. Are they task saturated? Can we declutter some information that's not necessarily as important right here, right now? It may become important. And we're leveraging AI to start looking at that, to start understanding the cognitive load through eye tracking, to say, hey, this human being is getting a little task saturated. Decisions are not as good or as crisp as they should be. Let's back off the information and prioritize the stuff that's important to us. Because ultimately, we need to be able to do this very safely. And some of the stuff that we talked about earlier on in terms of recognizing when pilots are task saturated or G-locked, or which is going unconscious because of G-force. Can the technology talk to the airplane, recover the airplane? And those systems are out there right now. It's saved many lives in the F-16, for example.
I was telling him about, just briefly behind stage, about Tom Furness and how he really should meet him at some point.
Yes,
a lot of his technology and the things that he was using in the planes that he was flying, he had developed. So.
There's some overlap there.
Very much so.
Yeah. So. Very interesting.
And there's some really fun stuff as well. Disney got involved with us and ultimately invested in us. And it was really cool. So one of the demos we did for Disney is ordinarily we take off in these airplanes, we go up into the sky, and we'd be dogfighting against the latest Chinese threats, whatever it might be. But for Disney, when they came to take a look at us, it was like connecting everything that I've loved in life. So we took them off, and we took them into a Star Wars world. So we went up in a real airplane, and we're dogfighting X-Wing fighters and TIE fighters.
That's cool.
We're going to the Millennium Falcon to take fuel, and we put the Death Star up there in the sky and two suns. It was like the craziest thing, firing lasers from the airplane. It was amazing, and that got Disney over the line, which was an interesting use case for the tech, because Disney and the theme parks is a really interesting place for AR to play as well. Absolutely. Because you have the massive infrastructure costs of the rides that need refreshing time after time. And so what we did is and then Disney have this abundance of digital content from all of the movies, like the Marvel franchise, Iron Man, all that kind of stuff. the question we asked ourselves is, could we blend the digital content with their physical experiences? And if we could do that, we go to a theme park ride. You might like it, Star Wars ride. I like the Little Mermaid, whatever it might be. But we can go onto this ride and have what we refer to as the digital customization of a shared physical experience. So we put it into the Incredicoaster at Disney World, and we rode the coaster, but in a digital world of the Incredibles running around outside of you. So really interesting opportunities for outdoor AR that's blending physical experiences with digital content as well.
That is fun. How did you get tied in with Disney?
I don't remember. I think they reached out to us. They've been tracking what we're doing online, and they said, hey, can we come and meet you guys? And they send the Imagineers around, and of course, all of these big-brained Imagineers come into Red 6, and we do what we always do. There's a lot of skepticism about what we've been doing in the industry because of the lavish claims that we've been making. Right. But the beautiful thing about it is we put them in the back of the airplane, we put a helmet on them, and we say, come see for yourself. And we took them up into Star Wars, and they're dogfighting in a real airplane against X-Wing fighters, and they just hit the I believe button, and obviously the rest is history.
Anybody barf doing that? Anybody?
A lot of people have been sick in the airplane. For sure. In fact, Glenn Snyder, who founded the company, I've mentioned him several times, it was just he and I for the longest time, the first year or so. The amount of vomit in the back cockpit, for any software engineers that think they have it tough, you just go speak to Glenn and ask what it's like to pull 6Gs and code real time in the back of an airplane. Yeah. It's challenging. Going upside down.
That's a vision.
That's hilarious. It's a lot of fun. Where do you think the technology is going from here? I mean, we've seen cycles of the technology with XR.
Yeah.
AI has been a thing for a while, and this year we're seeing it as much more of a thing, I think.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just at the talk that Fink and Shillowitz were doing. They do their podcasts, and they were talking about how there was a lot of MR. They thought there was going to be an enormous amount of AR here, and there was, but how there was a lot of MR here, and how that's sort of burgeoning a little bit more. In my field of working with artists and of all different kinds, they're really, a lot of them are on two sides of the fence, right? Some are worried that AI is going to, take over their job and whatever, and some are embracing it and figuring out how to work with that. And I think with every new technology, you have that problem, right? Some people are going to be displaced, and some people are going to, really embrace it and find a way to do it. I don't see it as much as taking over people's jobs or whatnot, as much as it is, people need to find different ways to do it. And I think, all the R's, XR, AR, VR, MR, whatever, are new opportunities for people. And I've been trying to get those visual effects artists and those design artists to look at this space, to get into Unreal, to do that for a number of years, and work with developers and programmers and whatnot to create things like you're creating and other people are creating. I've done them for POCs, but like really doing things that affect humanity and the world, and make this a better place. So I think there's huge opportunities for that in the future for those artists. It's just a matter of how you embrace it, and as you and I have been talking, consumer is really hard right now, but enterprise is huge. Training and education is a huge thing, and seeing in Microsoft's case, Copilot and the HoloLens working together, is great. And I know Apple's going to be doing the same thing, and Meta's doing the same thing, and Google's doing the same thing. So they're all on that same trajectory of incorporating AI with AR and or VR. So I think that's really what we're going to be seeing in the next bit, and that will, of course, expand tremendously as time goes on.
It changes so much when you can go from what I've always referenced as rectangular data. Our phones, our screens, our paper are all rectangular, and when you can get that into an environment and then interact with it. And I think we've been successful in getting the data into the environment where we can interpret it in a different way. I think with AI and the user interface advances that we're seeing, we're interacting with it, we're going to be able to in a whole different way, which gives us, it takes it a significant step beyond seeing the data and taking the action.
Sort of superhuman powers
Yes.
in some ways,
It is.
you know?
It's,
I mean, I think AI presents an enormous opportunity for AR and mixed reality as well, because what I'm really interested in, I don't see AI as the threat that necessarily people are articulating. I think we've seen this through history many times. I point us to like the agricultural revolution when machinery came on, you know, and it displaced initially a bunch of jobs, and we elected to educate a workforce and repurpose the jobs. And I think it's the same thing with AI. There will be jobs that disappear, but there'll be, I think, a number of jobs that are created, and probably more so in the margins. But this intersection or this interface between AI and human beings working together is where AR can play a really important role. So I actually think AI is an incredible opportunity for AI. I think in terms of the overall industry for AR, when we started thinking about Red 6, we looked at the pioneers, we looked at what Roni did at Magic Leap and the work that was going on at Microsoft. But the conclusion I came to is that there's no consumer market for AR back then, and I still don't believe there's a consumer market for AR right now. But that's not to say it won't come. But you know, let's say it's 10. We keep saying it's 5 to 10 years away. We keep saying that, right? But it's a ways away because you've got all of the problems associated with form factor and the technology. But for it to be a ubiquitous solution, it has to work outdoors on the move. It has to be mobile in nature. It has to be in a form factor you're willing to wear on your head. But even if you get to that potent cocktail of solutions, the honest question we have to ask ourselves is, what could we truly use the technology for? I haven't been able to answer that unequivocally yet. But I think there are enormous enterprise use cases for the technology. And as far as I could tell, you know, being inspired by the work you did with Iron Man and Ender's Game, DoD is a really compelling place to play for the technology and build it out in anticipation of this consumer market arising. Why? Because fundamentally there are use cases that I think only augmented reality can solve. And so AR, when I started looking at this in the early days, I kind of felt it was somewhat of a solution in search of a problem, absent of a really compelling use case. But sitting inside of DoD and the work we're doing is a use case that I think only AR can solve. And that's a really interesting proposition because it allows you to maturate the technology and solve real-world problems that absolutely matter, where there are revenues to be generated in anticipation of the consumer market coming. And when it pops, I think it's the single biggest inflection point in how we ultimately will share and interact with digital content since computers went to cell phones. And I'm really bullish. I just don't believe it's close.
Yeah.
I still think it's 10 years away.
And what you're doing actually saves money for the company, you know, for the, you know, the DOT or the trainers or whoever is doing that work.
Enormous amounts of money. It allows us to train effectively. But it also, to your previous point, it creates a safer environment as well, because we're able to train, you know, at frequency, relevancy, and scale, so we get better at our jobs. But of course, in simple terms, there's half the things to bump into out there, right? And bumping into other airplanes is not a good thing to do. So you get to start to train to another level, free of the risk of colliding with something, and maybe starting to explore things that we couldn't otherwise do in training, which makes us all the more effective when we go into operations and have to do the job for real. So there's enormous opportunities to play. And as we think about the long-term vision, it's not just airborne. It's not just the airborne environment of fighter pilots flying around in airplanes. It's connecting all players together across multiple domains: air, sea, land. What does that transition to? The North Star for us, I think, is when I was a kid growing up in a coal mine in the north of England, I used to run around with a stick in the woods, pretending to be a soldier, playing in the mud. And kids these days are sedentary on video games, inside playing Call of Duty, whatever it might be. I think the next big leap is blending the synthetic world, which we've done in the military, with the physical world. And maybe gaming becomes now a blending of outdoor solution as well. And that's where we're kind of tracking to with Red 6. That's the big end vision for us, is where I think it's a really interesting play for the consumer.
And you, when you were at Lockheed, you were saving tons of money doing what you were doing with the AR.
saved a tiny bit.
Yeah. So I mean, it's huge.
Our metric was at the time $38 per unit fastener. And Lockheed was purchasing 2 million of those per year. It was one of the use cases.
Yeah.
And that didn't count the other factors, the other things that you save beyond the touch labor. But we saw that, you can get the job done traditionally by measuring where these things go or by following the step-based instructions. But when you bring in new and different ways to access the data and interact with the data, it takes out the need for interpretation, and we measured it. So you can get to the task at hand much more rapidly than having to go in and interpret what the engineers had envisioned. And when we have to interpret, that means we have to imagine. And in a manufacturing, a very step-based process, we don't want to necessarily have them imagining, because that's where we induce error or faults. And so we took advantage of that, and we figured out areas where it was a good fit and saw some huge savings.
Yeah.
And a number of KPIs. One of the things that I also think is interesting in the Iron Man movie is at the start, JARVIS. Anyone know what JARVIS stands for? It's an acronym, from what I understand.
I actually didn't know this. She told me this.
Anyone know the acronym? And just another rather very intelligent system? I thought that was fun. I asked that question in West Texas at a middle school. Middle of nowhere, a little town close to my hometown where the judge is also the barber. And I said, do you guys know what JARVIS stands for? And 3 kids out of a group of about 40 knew what it stood for. Isn't that fun?
Yeah.
And rattled it off instantly.
That's amazing. We never got told that when we were doing the film.
Really?
We just had in a script, it says JARVIS. So.
See, when I say I studied the movie, I mean I studied the movie. Lots of groups that I've talked to did the same thing that we did, which was movie night. Let's go through, and we're rewinding and playing and rewinding and playing and studying those scenes, especially when we're trying to figure out, 10 or 15 years ago, how to interact with the data. At the start of Iron Man 1, you see JARVIS in the form of a smart home. The blinds come up, and it's giving the weather and those details. And then in JARVIS, in Iron Man 1, you see JARVIS with the table, where he's interacting with the table.
Yeah, it was kind of like the holographic table.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then as it advances, you see it become much more situationally aware and tied in with robotics.
Yep.
Interacting in ways that I think that's why we all studied it.
I mean, that was one of the things. How do you take what we did in the 50 or 60 shots that we did in Iron Man 1, and what is the next step of what JARVIS is becoming, and thinking about that obviously for 20 to 30 years out versus 100 years out or 200 years out. Trying to make it more relatable to what we might see in the near term future. So it's great to see it actually happening in real life. And we've had this discussion. It's reality. All the work that was done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, influencing fantasy in films, and then that creating reality, which is projects like what you're doing. So it's great to see how all of those things come together and influence, what we experience in real life. So.
Have you envisioned what the follow-on to what we consider today as JARVIS would be 10 or 20 years out of the time that
I think
created?
I don't still believe that there will be holograms that just appear here. I think we'll have some device of some sort that is doing the projection of those holograms. But I do view it as, this assistant that is taking you through, everything that you need in life, whatever it is. And you get to, it learns about you, and you tell it what you want and need in life in that regard. Whatever it is, training, knowledge, the thing that everybody has to realize is you have to train an AI and with lots of models of data input to be able to take it out. So you are a data input. What you do every day and all of that, it's going to learn what you're doing and try to give you the things that you need.
I think that's what's interesting about what you mentioned, Daniel, is it sensing the cognitive state of the pilot.
Sure.
And what it's presenting is dynamic based on what it understands of the state that you're in.
For sure, and you start to, I mean, it's to come full loop, right? Because it's not just the performance of the AI that you're interested in, it's the performance of the human being as well in conjunction with the AI. And one of the things we discovered is, because of the accuracy and the efficacy of the solution we have to create to draw accurately to pilots up in the sky, going upside down, all that kind of stuff, it allows you to extract a data set from the human being as well, which is incredibly valuable and important. Because ultimately, what we are trying to do in the fighter pilot community is we spend hours in the debrief ripping each other apart, right, and analyzing every decision we made. And what we're trying to drive at is understanding why human beings make the decisions they make when they're under duress. So was it a perception-based error? Was it a selection of course of action error? Or was it an execution error? And there's contributing factors and root cause analysis that go into that. But inevitably, there's a degree of subjectivity as we're starting to peel that proverbial onion apart and understand why we made the decisions. But one of the technologies we've built now is the ability to not just go up and fly this stuff in the air, but we can bring it back to the ground now and enter a VR environment where we can go right back into the cockpit and understand what the pilot was doing at the exact time they made the decision. And they can't BS us anymore, right? Because we can look in and say, were you even looking in the right place? And they traditionally go, yeah, of course I was. And then you see in VR, they weren't. They were looking at whatever it was. So we can start to pull and analyze in a much more effective way. And that allows us to build data sets which are incredibly valuable to inform decisions as fundamental as where do you go search for these kids. Because the role of a fighter pilot is changing massively, right? In my day, I kind of spanned the traditional gunslinger, go up there for a kind of proverbial fist fight, into flying the F-22, which was managing massive sensors and systems as well, into the next big leap. And so the role of a fighter pilot is changing into a systems manager. And therein affords us the opportunity of, yes, AI working as assistants to help us manage the load, but AR being the interface between the two as well. And so there's a beautiful elegance that goes full circle between AI, AR, and human performance.
This is fascinating. So I could ask questions all day, but I wanted to see if anyone has a question for the group here.
Oh, good. House lights. No questions?
Any questions?
There's one over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about JARVIS. So I attended a conference a couple years ago on a guy that did a session on, he created his own JARVIS and taught us how to do the code to create that same system, to have a JARVIS as part of our home automation system in a home environment. And I thought that was pretty cool, and I had wanted to do it. I was really stoked about it, but just haven't found the time to do it. But I was wondering if you heard of any other awesome things that people have done with being inspired by JARVIS, where they created their own JARVIS.
I mean, I haven't, nothing, I mean, what we saw 2 weeks ago to me was like that epiphany of like, okay, it's here.
And
and I'm sure people have been seeing that behind that curtain for a while now. But for me, it was, you had brought me up to say like, hey, look, this is what you thought of and your team thought of 15 years ago is actually reality now. That I think you're going to see a lot more, obviously, of that, from here on out.
I hear it all the time in the form, the team that you met at Microsoft, when I told them Ian was going to be there, the reaction was fantastic. Because they were just like me. They were like, we studied his work. This is going to be fantastic, When I would put a device on a technician on the spacecraft manufacturing floor, and they could hold their hand out and control the data, I cannot tell you how many times. I mean, it's in the 3-digit numbers. They would say, I feel like Iron Man. Has anyone else here had people say that when they put on a device? Yes. So, I think it's inspiring, and I think that's what comes to mind for many people when they're interacting in these spaces.
It is cool that the work that all these designers did, has created inspiration for other people. I mean, that is really something fulfilling, because when you're doing the movie, you're not thinking about that. You're just thinking about doing the shots and getting the work out and doing that. But to be here, 15 years later and see how that has inspired, people is great. Minority Report did that. Other movies have done that. So it's great to see how, designers and their ideas and thoughts and the research that they do and everything, actually becomes something that people are referencing and using,
I apologize that we don't have time for more questions. I'm seeing our time here. We're going to be around, so if you would like to catch us for a question, we may be able to do that.
Sure.
I want to thank you all for being here, and thank you
you.
too so much.
Thank
This
you
is
for
such a
having us.
fun conversation for me.